To set the tone for the meeting, I will read an extract from chapter Working with Others, page 96. Do not discourage if your prospect does not respond at once. Search out another alcoholic and try again. You are sure to find someone desperate enough to accept with eagerness what you offer. You find it a waste of time to keep chasing a man who cannot or will not work with you. If you leave such a person alone, he may soon become convinced that he cannot recover by himself. To spend too much time on any one situation is to deny some other alcoholic an opportunity to live and be happy. One of our fellowship failed entirely with his first half dozen prospects. He often says that if he had continued to work on them, he might have deprived many others who have since recovered of their chance. Tonight's meeting is part 3 of Working Step 12 with the sponsee, and Tim will share anything between 30 and 45 minutes on the topic, after which the floor will be open for questions rather than the typical share. I will now hand it over to Tim. Please, Tim.
Thanks, Omar. Can you all hear me all right? Okay. I think the voice is coming through my headset. If you have trouble hearing me, if it goes in and out, then there's something, so let me know straight away so I can fix it, because there are different ways I can connect the sound. One topic which is very common in sponsorship, the call starts something like this. Someone calls and says, since 8 o'clock this morning, I've been feeling very, and then they tell you how they've been feeling. And then they say, maybe I ought to join, and then they name another fellowship. You know, which is a life-changing decision. You know, I'm going to spend the rest of my life going to at least one meeting a week and sponsoring people, you know, day in, day out for the rest of my, now. What I'd say first of all about this, I've very often had sponsees who, unless they go to OA and get an OA sponsor and call to do their daily food plan and acquire some abstinence and, you know, do all of that, then there's no point in sponsoring them in AA because they won't be able to do anything. Particularly if it's really kind of, you know, galloping bulimia or anorexia, it renders people, both of those will render people in a state where they're just unable to take anything in. So unless you know, they might as well be taking heroin, frankly, as far as the AA program is concerned. So what I've learned with AA sponsees who also have a food thing going on, and I'm going to be really blunt here, if they look underweight, they're probably underweight, and if they're underweight, there's probably a food problem going on, because very few people in society are like technically underweight as far as BMI is concerned. And when I've called it out, I've never been wrong. In retrospect, they've always ended up in OA and admitted they're anorexics. So you're not, if you think it, it's unlikely to be wrong. And you'll go around in circles until the food stuff is dealt with. And it's the same in my experience with people who are like full-blown sex addicts with really kind of you know, dangerously antisocial behavior and all that. And sometimes undercover as well. But there's my experience with sponsees with problems in sex. There's a line in the big book that everyone has problems with sex, and there's I think it's true with food as well. Everyone seems to have very few people come into recovery with a completely ordered relationship with food. There's usually something going on. So there's a spectrum here, and who knows where the line is. But I've had the same experience with people, with sponsees who are kind of full-blown sex addicts, you know, rushing around doing what they're doing. And the AA program doesn't take until that's dealt with head on. And in particular, I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but crystal meth. If there's crystal meth in the mix, there are usually activities which involve other people, and we're not talking backgammon or tango. Now, unless that whole cluster of drugs and other activities is dealt with, there's someone else here. Unless that's dealt with, again, the program won't take. And Jim Willis says in his workbooks, he says, unless you've got a clear mind for this process, it won't work, because you need a clear mind to do the process. If someone's engaged in an active addiction, then it needs to stop. Now, I would draw a contrast between that and someone who's 18 months sober, has done half of their amends, and has problems in their romantic relationship. Someone who hasn't made amends to any of their exes and is having problems in their romantic relationship. Well, maybe I ought to do SLA 18 times a week. Well, maybe. But the thing is there's a little bit of history here. The reason why multiple fellowships exist is because step one needs a rallying point. And if you've got a problem, if alcohol isn't your problem, you can't be a member of AA. So why those other fellowships developed is to give the 12 steps as an available option to people who couldn't access them through AA because they don't qualify. Now, it doesn't mean that one can't benefit from these other fellowships, but the fallacy is because a fellowship exists for sex and relationships, suddenly sex and relationships can't be dealt with in AA or CA or Al-Anon, because there's a specific fellowship for that. So one must sort of go over there for that. And of course, when you go, you say, right, I'm going to go to SLA to solve my relationship problems. You say, well, what have you got for me? And they say, the 12 steps. You say, what? The ones I've just said don't work over there. Well, why are they going to work over here? It's the steps which do the business. Now, it doesn't mean, I got a huge amount of benefit from other fellowships. I say it's not to diss the notion of going to other fellowships or multiple fellowships, but one's got to be clear what one's doing. And I talked to a very, very nice person who I like a lot. He's been in recovery for 20 odd years, who we were discussing this, and about how sometimes it can feel that you're taking your little shopping trolley to all of these different fellowships and loading up your shopping trolley with little tidbits from each one, and God is falling between the cracks. So one is trying to acquire tools and mechanisms and insights to somehow do a jigsaw puzzle to produce a recovered person. And what you end up with is a sort of Frankenstein's monster with no life of its own. And I did this myself. The combinations of different fellowships and psychotherapy and the adult children of alcoholics books and the codependency books and all of this, and my alcoholism, it grew like weeds in the cracks between these, because I was still in charge. There wasn't the notion of just letting go of everything and saying, God, what do I do next? Give me the next right action. Give me the next right action. Give me the next right action. Other phenomena, this is a little bit random. This isn't a structured, orderly thing, so I apologize for that. So it's going to come out as it comes out. One danger is to not complete the AA program, realize there's still some stuff that is not fixed, and think the answer is another fellowship. And of course, that puts you back at step one and delays the completion of the step 9. And your ego will love this. Oh, goody, another step 4, another examination of myself, when the amends haven't been completed from the first step 4. I think a super helpful approach with the steps is to be both systematic and simple. So if you decide you're going to do the steps in one fellowship, complete them, complete every last amend, do sane and sound ideals for all of the other problem areas, maybe get some input from people who've got experience in those areas, maybe from other fellowships. I've got really helpful. I'm not a member of SLA, but I've got really helpful ideas from SLA about bottom lines and things like that in that area. That was a big problem area for me. So what, you know, in AA, one can learn from other fellowships without going and becoming a fully fledged member, putting yourself back at step one and ending up in multiple step processes. So complete the steps, do a bunch of sane and sound ideals, start sponsoring people and give it a year and see whether things calm down. When I had, as Chris Raymond would call it, a barnstorming spiritual experience in, oh, I don't know, I was about 15 years sober. It knocks you sideways, and all of the other problems were still there at the end of it in one way or another, often internally. It took 2 or 3 years for all of that to calm down. It took 2 or 3 years for that single spiritual experience. This was at 15 years sober. It took 2 or 3 years before it's like when a wave hits, you know, it's going to knock everything all over the place, and it takes a while to reconstruct, to learn all the lessons there are to learn. And I just needed to, someone on here is going to laugh at this phrase. What's that thing about time? Let time take time, or I can't even remember the phrase, but let time do its work. And very often these things, they have in my experience, they have these other problems. Most of them have a habit of just dissolving gradually over time, just through consistent application of steps 10, 11, and 12, lots of service, lots of sponsorship. And you wake up a couple of years later and a problem, give time. That was it. They have a problem working themselves out without me having to hammer at something. The point of the higher power is I don't solve my own problems by obsessive activity. I solve it by letting go, keeping out of my own way, and staying out of my own mind for long enough for it to literally physically heal, for the old neural pathways to dissolve, for the neurons literally to the chemicals in the neurons literally to be repurposed to build new neural pathways. I mean, this is not this is actually what happens in your brain. If certain neural pathways aren't used, your brain repurposes them, and that takes a lot of time. So I've saved myself a lot of grief by giving time, completing a set of steps once, and then giving it time, and then seeing what's left over. And then you see what's important. Then I could see, okay, this is something that needs dealing with. That is something that needs dealing with. The other thing as well, it can get very confusing to go to a whole bunch of different fellowships at once, to be in different steps on different fellowships, having multiple sponsors in different fellowships. I've seen people who are very adroit and skillful at maybe 20 years, juggling having an Al-Anon sponsor and an AA sponsor and a this sponsor and a that sponsor, but it takes a lot of skill. It's just like when people are in therapy. If you've had sponsors who are in therapy, there's nothing wrong with therapy. If you have sponsors who are in therapy, they'll often spend a lot of time taking everything that you've said to the therapist, seeing what the therapist says about it, and then taking everything that the therapist says, telling you about it, and then you feel as though you're having a conversation with the therapist via the sponsee, and they're the center of an awful lot of professional attention. So it can be, people can end up playing systems off against each other. They're not being mean or malicious or difficult on purpose. It's just how people operate. I've done it, and I've seen other people do it. So do one thing at a time, do it properly, let it settle. I'm sure Evan will be able to sort of correct me on this about when you're trying to fix code, you try one thing at a time and you fix that, and you see if you run it again, you see if it works. So it doesn't work. If you change two things at once and then you rerun it, you don't know which thing fixed it. Regression testing. There you go. So to try one thing at a time, try it really properly and give it time and let it work itself through. As I say, the big caveat there, is if there is as they would say with liver disease, a fulminating liver disease or galloping consumption, some addictive process which is just totally blocking you from even engaging in the process. And it can be, you get 10 people with dysfunctional relationships, 9 can work the program and heal in that relationship. 1 out of 10 needs to be out of the relationship and block the number for 6 months before they can even start to thaw out from the from the toxicity. I'm sorry, I'm mixing metaphors. They're detoxified from the toxicity of that relationship, and it can take a while to figure out which is going on. So you know, is it okay for your sponsee to do 3 fellowships? With some people, it's absolutely the right thing to do. With other people, they won't make progress in any. So it's something that has to be played very much by ear, and one's got to examine each situation, talk around, ask around. One point about multiple fellowships as well. It can be very sensible to escalate gradually. So first of all, one can read the books of a fellowship and listen to some tapes and go to a few meetings. And honestly, I've known people that have done that with some Al-Anon stuff. They've read some books, they've gone to a few meetings, they've written down some tips, and they bolt those materials onto their existing AA program. Other people need to go further and go to a meeting regularly. Other people need to go further and do the first 3 steps in that fellowship. That's a super helpful way, because once you get to step 4 in most fellowships, things are pretty much the same. So what I get people to do who've got food or sex problems is to definitely do steps 1, 2, 3 in SLA or SA or OA, and then kind of, it's like tributaries to a river. You get to step 4, you're doing step 4 to 9 on your whole life. As long as you've examined the powerlessness and the insanity and you've surrendered that area, and you've got, if it's, you know, SA or SLA, you've got some bottom lines and some middle lines and some these lines and some those lines, and with OA you've got your daily plans and whatever. You know, some people have little scales where they measure things, other people are much more intuitive about things, but you've got a plan in place and someone to be accountable to, and then you can combine multiple fellowships and it doesn't cause a problem, because you've basically got a single process with multiple tributaries in the first 3 steps. And then the final the final stage, if that doesn't work, if you're still screwed, you might need to, you know, become a fully fledged member of the other fellowship. And what I've seen work pretty well, for about 5 years, Tom gave me this notion of when you're standing somewhere, like in a queue, you're usually leaning more on one leg rather than the other leg. So both legs are supporting you, but you're leaning primarily on the left leg or primarily on the right leg. And in my first 11 years of AA, first 11 years of recovery, I was leaning on my AA leg with a little bit of Al-Anon thrown in. I then had 5 years of leaning almost entirely on my Al-Anon leg. Al-Anon was the absolute core of my life, but I was still doing AA as a fully fledged member. And then it switched again at 15, 16 years, and I went back to AA as my main thing. In the last couple of years, I'm leaning about 60% AA, 40% Anon. So that the weight can change, and I've seen people do that with, you know, UA and DA and GA, all sorts of other things. But to know which one the primary weight, where the primary weight is, where home is, it's very difficult to have a real home, in my experience, in more than one place. The loyalty always seems to gravitate. There's always in my case, maybe other people are different, there's a center of gravity somewhere, and that can shift. And I've had to let it shift where it needs to shift for me to be entirely at home. So years 11 to 15, 11 to 16, somewhere around there, I was doing a lot of AA service. And my problem was that I'd be in like an intergroup meeting, and someone would say something, my whole body would tense up and I would stop breathing. And then basically I was reacting to some angry alcoholics. I won't say which intergroup. I was reacting to some angry alcoholics who were starting to get a bit tense, and I needed somewhere to go to examine my reaction to alcoholics so I could continue to go to AA, because I did not want to carry on going. I find it very difficult to be around alcoholics. Had the same thing because of sponsorship as well. You know, if you're called by 20 or 30 people a week, if you haven't got your wits about you, it can grind you down if you're not triaging things correctly. So to cut a long story short, there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach with sponsees and other fellowships. There's a whole range of different experiences, and all you can do is give some advice and guidance, and they get to follow their conscience. And there's a great line in the book where if he wants to try a different approach, he should follow his conscience. I think it says conscience. I may be wrong there, but anyway, it's not follow the latest idea that's come into his head. It's a genuine matter of conscience, which requires deep contemplation. Before I go on to the thorny topics of sex, food, and dating, does anyone have any questions about any of that? Claire.
Just a quick question, and it's more the logistics of it. So if you would be working with an alcoholic through the steps of AA, and then halfway through the step work, other problems start to show their face, like dramatic weight loss and so forth, would you pause the work and suggest that they at least join other fellowship, make friends there, rather than stop the step work? I don't know, pause it, or ask them to go to another fellowship but carry on the work through to step 9?
There's a sort of process of escalation. It's very rare that you get halfway through the steps and then discover that there's a problem with food or there's a problem with sex. You usually find out pretty soon. You know, the bags under the eyes will tell you that there's something going on. Where it usually crops up is actually in the early stages, where people relapse on alcohol. And one of the first things I always find out is what's going on with sex, what's going on with food. And very, very often, if someone is doing a whole load of work in AA, but then they're relapsing, it's almost always the case there is another addiction which hasn't been addressed. And so they've been kind of using the whole time on food or on sex. And that's why the defenses are down with alcohol. If something comes up midstream, as it were, I shouldn't really use midstream with sex addiction. If something comes up halfway through, you go for the tests. If something comes up halfway through the steps, I mean, first of all, you can try basic, turn the area over to the higher power, talk to a friend in OA, get a plan in place for the food, whatever. Stay away from the sex clubs. Can you stay away from the sex clubs for a week? Very often people, if they've got a strongish AA program, you discover that the abstinence side of things is actually not a big deal. If they're having trouble maintaining abstinence from really critically dangerous behaviors, then they go to the Saturday morning OA meeting in Soho. Do not pass go, do not collect £200, talk to X, Y, and Z. And what I suggest people do is do steps 1, 2, and 3 in that fellowship in a weekend. Like, they've already done steps 1, 2, and 3. They already know the big book. It's taking the information they know about how the structure of addiction works, and then immediately just applying it in that other area. and committing to a few OA meetings a week, a few SA meetings a week. So you nobble it straight away. You don't want to halt the step work and put someone into a great big introspective process, because honestly, if it's been if they've got a sex addiction, or if they've got a food problem, it's been going on for years. It's not like they don't know about it. It's not like it's come up from nowhere. Are you willing? Are you willing to do something about it? And my observation, I've been amazed and hugely gratified. The people that are willing to go to the fellowship and deal with it and go to meetings are immensely relieved that there are other people with the same problem, and they get instant hope. It's that thing of the shock of AA when you join AA is enough to overcome the resistance and fear of giving up the addiction. It's so overwhelmingly positive. And with a bit of luck, they'll have that experience with OA. If they go to some really strong OA, really strong SA meetings, they're bowled over by all the support. And the last couple of years, when sponsees of mine have done that, they've done really, really well. It's amazing. They've done amazingly well. So you catch it straight away. If it doesn't yield to just the basic corrective measures of the daily program, immediately launch them to the strongest people in that area, and that usually puts the kibosh on it. Any other questions?
Thank you, Tim, for the presentation. Omar, alcoholic. If I'm sponsoring someone and that sponsee is acting out in other forms of addiction, will I be able to detect that in his performance in the 12 steps program?
My experience, usually, you'll find it comes out sideways. People always betray themselves one way or another. I mean, not on this topic specifically, but when you listen to how people describe things, it's people's unconscious language which reveals what's going on. And the daily plans will usually reveal it, and the daily review, because if there's an addiction going on, it's almost certainly causing trouble. Occasionally there are people who are very skilled at keeping things compartmentalized. I could do this for a while, but only for a while. So usually it comes out and you'll discover it one way or another. And it doesn't take many, if you're talking to them on a regular basis, it'll come out. So I don't think you need to worry about that. Most people are just not good enough at covering their tracks.
Thanks.
So if there are no questions on that, and of course, I mean, the thing is with the food and sex stuff and gambling and whatever, send them to the expert. If you've got any doubts, send them to the experts who are the members of SA, send the Al-Anons to people who are like 100% Al-Anon, send the food people to people who are like mainly OA, or for whom that's one of their two primary things. So if you feel out of your depth, maybe you are, send them to someone who's got more experience. So I've got lists of people. I just shoot them straight through to the OA people on that, because they're much better than me on that. I can deal with the sex stuff, but the food stuff is not really my area. So I think food, we've kind of covered that already. With the sex stuff, I think we've covered that already, actually. You deal with people who've got problems in that area. You deal with it within the home program, which is AA or CA or whatever, with the sane and sound ideal. So out of on page 69, out of the sex inventory, you get to devise with the higher power a sane and sound ideal towards which you're willing to grow. And then that can be applied to any of the other problems that are presenting. As I say, escalate to another fellowship if necessary, through the stages of visiting, listening, reading, to becoming a regular member of a group, to doing the first 3 steps, to doing all of the steps, you know. So I've had sponsees that do the steps with me and then go to the other fellowship and do the steps from the beginning, but only once they've completed the steps with me. I don't think I've got anything else to say on food or sex. I don't know if people have questions about either of those 2 topics. With there's one aspect of sort of dating and relationships. And there is a fellowship for the dating and relationship side of it, and it's SLA is the obvious one. But with this one, my experience in AA is that almost every addict, I was certainly like this, almost every addict has a problematical relationship with dating and relationships for a couple of key reasons. And the first one is basic selfishness, and I'm talking about myself here, basic selfishness. And the second one is the notion of the special relationship. So let's do the selfishness. I'm trying to think of a way to come at this without being too rude about myself or other people. It's a delicate topic, this. Tom gives the example of, you know, those lizards, those large lizards called Komodo dragons that some people have as pets. He said, your pet Komodo dragon does not love you. It loves heat and it loves flies. You're currently supplying both, so it's performing love. And addicts can be a little bit like this. I'm going to read something out if I can find it. If you'll let me pause for a moment while I look for something. And Claire will be amused at the source of this, I'm sure. It's from a psychiatrist from the I think middle of the 20th century called Otto Fenichel. I don't know if you've heard of him. And he writes this on love addiction. A person who is fixed on the state where his self-esteem is regulated by external supplies goes through this world in a condition of perpetual greediness. If his narcissistic needs are not satisfied, his self-esteem diminishes to a danger point. He is ready to do anything to avoid this. On the one hand, the fixation of such persons manifests itself in a tendency to react to frustrations with violence. On the other hand, their dependence impels them to try to get what they need by ingratiation and submissiveness. The conflict between these contradictory devices is characteristic for persons with this predisposition. These persons, and this is where it gets particularly spicy, these persons in their continuous need of supplies that give satisfaction and heightened self-esteem simultaneously are love addicts. Unable to love actively, they passively need to feel loved. They're characterized by the dependence and their narcissistic type of object choice, and they tend to change objects frequently because no object is able to provide the necessary satisfaction. Without giving any consideration to the feelings of their fellow man, they demand of them an understanding of their own feelings. They are always bent upon establishing a good understanding with people, though they are unable to fulfill their own part of such an understanding. This need compels them to attempt to deny their ever-present readiness to react hostilely. A couple more points. The personality of the object is of no great importance. They need the supplies, and it does not matter who provides them. Heat and flies. It does not necessarily have to be a person. It may be a drug or an obsessive hobby. Some persons of this type fare worse than others. They not only need supplies, but simultaneously fear getting them because they unconsciously consider them dangerous. As in the case of drug addicts, love addicts too may become incapable of getting the desired satisfaction, which in turn increases their addiction. Now, I'm sure you're much nicer than I am. I identify with that in a rather painful, vivid way. It characterizes a big chunk of my life. And I took that mindset into romantic relationships. And then I was terribly surprised when none of these relationships worked out, because no one could ever satisfy the need inside me. That's what it's talking about. You're trying to get an external source to fill an internal void, and society will support you in looking to romantic relationships to do this. The films and the books and so on. There's a Sondheim line: "A slotted spoon doesn't hold much soup." And as a slotted spoon, it doesn't matter how much love was poured in, it was never enough, and I couldn't keep it there. And so I was constantly trying to get the other person to love me more or love me better, and they couldn't. So I became bitter and hostile towards them. They say in old-fashioned AA, in your first year, get a pot plant. If the pot plant survives in the second year, get a hamster or a gerbil, not a higher life form, something which doesn't require much, or maybe a stick insect. If the stick insect doesn't die at your hand, try some tropical fish. When you're maybe 5 or 6 years sober, consider a kitten. When you're 7 or 8 years sober, consider a puppy. When you're 10 years sober, maybe go on a date or two. Tom describes how in California, they'd have to get at the young people's meetings, the newcomers, to repeat them to themselves: if I don't get laid, I'm not gonna die. If I don't get laid, I'm not gonna die. Dysfunctional relationships. Tom quotes a chap called Glenn, who is a member of 19 different 12-step fellowships, who talks about his object for a good romantic relationship. The orphan with the big eyes and the broken wing. He says, I can sniff them out through lead. And Tom's advice in these situations: if you go into a room and your eyes meet across the room at someone you know is the one, don't even say hello. Find someone you find dull and go for a walk in the park with them 6 times to see if there's someone you can develop the skill of having a conversation with. These toxic relationships. I'm sure I've said this one before, that there was a video I saw on Facebook. It was a girl doing one of those smudging ceremonies. She wasn't Native American, but she was doing a Native American smudging ceremony with the burning the sage and the incantations to get rid of the toxic energy in the room. And the caption underneath was using a Native American ceremony to get rid of the toxicity in the room when you are the toxicity in the room. So I would take my toxicity into romantic relationships, which were just repeats of each other. There were these attempts to mend my wounded self-esteem by extracting specialness from another person, because I felt I was giving up I was surrendering my worthlessness in return for their specialness. I felt I was cheating the other person, and so felt hostile towards them for falling for the ruse. I lost respect for anyone who was interested. If they weren't interested, they could see the truth, therefore they had my respect. So I was after the people who were unavailable. As soon as someone was available, they sickened me, because I could see they couldn't see through the ruse. It was all very complicated, and it doomed me to years of extremely unsatisfactory relationships. Now, that's a kind of collage of all sorts of different things. How does this work with sponsees? If your sponsee has a pattern of toxic relationships, the way, frankly, if they're in one, there's probably not, as when I asked my friend, my sponsor Doug once, how to deal with a particularly difficult situation, he said hide, on the basis that there's probably nothing you can say or do. If they're in a toxic relationship, there's probably nothing you can say or do. It's just like they're in an addiction. It will need to work itself through. I needed to learn how to be in relationships, like intimate relationships, which work. I've been with someone for 17 years or so. I need to do that by learning how to be a friend, how to be a colleague, how to be a normal human being or a healthy human being in all sorts of ordinary settings before I could work up to the very, very perilous task of having an intimate relationship. I couldn't go straight in with those and have them work. I needed to learn how to just be an ordinary person first. You wouldn't be able to answer the buzzer thing. Is I think he's got keys anyway. I needed to work up to it, and I needed to. It talks in the big book. It's very clever. If the relationship is going to work, it has to be on an entirely new basis, and because the old basis didn't work. I had a sequence of, so I had a reasonably healthy relationship for a few years in AA, and then that broke up, and then I went back to crazy land. Basically, the old me got revived, the unprocessed sort of love addict, relationship addict me got revived, and the whole thing blew up again. And what I had to do was to learn how to have relationships with an entirely new type of person on an entirely new basis. I'm just going to close the door. And now the source for this, there are several sources. Don Pritz, you can point him towards Don Pritz, who says, I don't know how to have a healthy sick relationship. What's a sick relationship? It's a relationship you want anything out of. Someone said to me a few years ago, the two reasons to have an intimate relationship is if you're lacking opportunities for forgiveness and lacking opportunities for service. If you feel that you're just not useful enough, you're just doing, you're getting your way too much of the time, and you're just spending too much time doing fun stuff for yourself. You want to just sacrifice some stuff, and you're just getting on too well with everyone. There's just nothing to forgive. You're getting out of practice with forgiveness. Then I've got a great idea for you. Intimate relationship. It will solve these two problems instantly. And the job, Rabbi Harold Kushner talks about this, about forgiveness and service being the two main ingredients. Rabbi Manis Friedman is very good. And there are lots and lots of other authors as well. And so to treat and this is the thing to use the intimate relationship as basically an extension of the program generally. It's not like a special carved out area. It's a venue for the two activities of forgiveness and service. And the way I learned to have healthy relationships, the first stage was you've got to stop having the toxic ones. And the chief way to stop having the toxic ones, in my experience, was to, as Tom suggested, not say hello to the toxic people. And they're toxic because you're attracted to them, if you have a toxic history. So I had to be super careful and super boundaried about who I went on dates with, who I showed interest in, and to look out for people with different qualities. And I've got loads of materials that I send sponsees. These are the qualities that if you want a healthy relationship, these are the qualities to look for in someone else. But the only way you're going to attract those people is to become those things yourself. So to learn how to develop the the qualities of emotional balance and maturity and selflessness and prudence and forethought and reasonableness and flexibility and all of those other things, that if one learns how to demonstrate those, one will automatically attract different people, and the toxic people will run like a mile from you. You won't even have to avoid them anymore after a while, because they will sniff that you're not up for the dance. So the difficulty with with sponsees, there are if they're, as I said, if they're in a toxic relationship, there's almost nothing you can do unless they're willing to take a break from it. The ones who are not and are just re-entering the dating game, I just pass on everything I've just said to you about that you can't take that mindset of treating the relationship as a source of something to satisfy, to mend one's wounded self-esteem, or to give one identity or something like that, and make it work. It has to be on an entirely new basis. And if people are willing to work on that new basis, then it works very well. And that's pretty much it on the sort of dating and relationship side of things. Everything I know comes from people who have been married for 10, 20, 30, 40 or 50 years, and from books by mostly rabbis and some other people who are marriage guidance counselors and so on. That's where, now, I haven't devised anything myself. Everything I've got from other people. Also, Al-Anon Al-Anon principles really help if people are struggling in intimate relationships to recognize that the let it begin with me and all of the detachment stuff is immensely helpful for a lot of people. Does anyone have any questions about the dating and relationship side of things? James.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, I've got a question about, so what's happened a couple of times when I've been sponsoring people is that who are alcoholics, if the alcoholics in a long-term relationship, they come into recovery and they get sober and it's all great for a while, but then the person I'm sponsoring starts to say that their partner raises issues about the sheer amount of time they're spending involved with AA. So for a while it's all great, but then as time goes on, there seems to be like I suppose possibly a resentment that's happening in the relationship with the non-alcoholic. And do you have suggestions about what might help a person who finds themselves in that situation? I'm not talking about a toxic relationship, I'm just talking about a relationship where this occurs.
Yeah, so that's a rare problem, mostly because most people have burnt their relationships to the ground by the time they get into AA. I've had very few sponsees that have come in with an intact relationship, but that's always a problem when they have an intact relationship. Unfortunately, the difficult thing is most of the ones that come in with an intact relationship, when they get well, the relationship breaks down because the other person was as unwell as they were, either as alcoholics or addicts or as codependents or Al-Anons. And unless they engage in a recovery process, it's very, in my experience, in my own sponsee history, it's been very rare for those relationships to survive. It occasionally happens. But it's not just with intimate relationships. You get this with family obligations, with friends as well. People's friends get bitter sometimes about AA. One of my sponsors' great things he bangs on about a lot is on page 19, a much more important demonstration of our principles lies in our respective homes, occupations and affairs. And it can take a while to figure out whether the spouse is complaining, let's say it's a spouse, whether the spouse is complaining because the sponsee is is taking the mickey, is not fulfilling their family obligations, is just not around anymore. You get to listen to Bob Bizantz and Linda Bizantz. So he's been in AA for 5,000 years. She's been in Al-Anon for 5,000 years, and they do panels together. And they're very good about, it often happens in, somewhere around 6-7 years, both of them super active in their respective programs, but like ships in the night, not, they occasionally meet across the kitchen table going in opposite directions, but that's it. And so and it talks in the big book about this, so you can point them straight back to the big book, that a program which doesn't involve the family obligations is no program at all. And so usually there's a way around that. However, sometimes there's something else going on, and it's essentially a subconscious resentment on the part of the spouse that AA is doing for the spouse what they were unable to do. And it comes out as something else. The other thing that may happen, if the person themselves is very, very codependent and needy, however much the person gives them, it will never be enough. So when they had all of their time, it wasn't enough. And now AA is even getting 10% of the time is too much, because even when they're getting all of them, they're feeling unsatisfied. I've seen that a number of times. So you've got to ferret out what's actually going on there. But sometimes the spouse you're like totally behind the spouse because the sponsor is being totally unreasonable. And other times you think, oh dear, this is, sometimes the person's going to one meeting a week, and the spouse says you're always at AA, and they're just not. It's the fact they're going at all becomes a point of contention. So one's got to listen very carefully and find out what's going on, because there's often a story behind that. Does that make sense, James?
Yes, yeah, it does. Thank you, Tim.
Harry.
Hey, Harry, alcoholic. Thanks, Tim, for that. So I was trying to think through my sponsees. I think there's kind of three categories. One, people already in long-term relationships, and you've got, some work in the programs to do there. People who are, which is, I think, really the emphasis of what you were getting at with lots of the stuff you were just talking about. So lots of people are very keen to get messy and get dating and get active. And so the guidance to maybe wait 10 years and see it as an opportunity for service and forgiveness, that's what I'll deploy with them. But there's another category, which is, I encounter people who are quite fretful about getting into relationships and very nervous and very timid. And actually, it's a problem in another direction. It feels like, it's a very mean kind of area of their life. And with a couple of people, I've actually said, maybe you should go and make a mistake. Go and try and date some people who maybe make a mistake. What do you reckon to that?
If you expose yourself, I should use that phrase cautiously. If you expose yourself to social media, I don't mean anything else. To films and to books, you can get the idea that the two important things in life are sex and money, or romantic love and money, or career. Gets dressed up as career and marriage, but it's the same, boils down to the same thing. And there's a distortion there. I'd assert that people are a lot poorer going through life without learning at least something of a foreign language and something of a musical instrument. But people think nothing of going through life without learning a musical instrument. And honestly, to me, that's up there with career and sex, for instance. I had a psychotherapist once called Sally, who was marvelous in all sorts of ways. And she said that she blamed a lot of problems that her therapies had on the program Friends. I don't know if anyone remembers the program Friends. So people would watch Friends and see these bunch of people who were friends, who hung out with each other all the time and spent a lot of time in each other's flats and were fun, and they were funny and they had a good time. And when they had a When they have a problem, it's solved within 23 minutes. And then they'd come in and talk about their actual relationships and feel incredibly inadequate because their relationship, their friendships did not match what they were seeing on Friends. And I think people can suffer from this enormously in the area of sex and romance. And I've got this sort of idealistic ideas of what these things should look like, which are entirely unrealistic. One can, of course, make a project of dating. My sponsor, actually, I had a sponsor when I was in my second year. I was joking about the 10 years. Maybe for some people it does take 10 years. Maybe other people, you work the steps, you dip your toe in the water in the second year or the third year. But my sponsor said, I said, I'm not meeting anyone. He said, are you going to places where you can meet people? No, I'm not. Well, of course, you have to place, it's like with finding a job, you have to be applying for jobs to be offered a job. And so to take the action, it's just like with everything else. If you're timid about work, to take the action and then put the results in God's hands. Take the act, keep taking the action, review it, talk to, just like with anything else, talk to people who are successful in this area, find out what they did and do what they did. A good point, a case in point, I got to spend some time with Jim Willis about 10 years ago. He was I think he was over 50 years sober at that time and around 50 years married. And he talked about intimate relationships. And if you've got your own kind of weirdness and darkness, you don't bring that and put it on the dining room table for your spouse to deal with. You go and find someone to deal with it. They've got their own stuff. They don't have to deal with yours as well. And it runs totally against a lot of, contemporary wisdom about you got to tell everyone everything and openness. But I figured he's married for 50 years. I'd like to be married for 50 years. I'm going to do what he does. And so I just copy. And so I get people who are timid about, it's a very common thing, being timid about dating, timid about relationships. Copy people who are successful at it. Find out what they do and copy. Monkey see, monkey do. And yeah, I think you're right, absolute, to make lots of mistakes. But also, sometimes treating dating as a project in itself sort of dooms you to failure because it places too much emphasis on the outcome. Often people it's because they're fixated on the outcome. I need to have an intimate relationship and I'm not a worthy member of society unless I'm doing things with my body, with someone else's body in the dark somewhere. That's the idea. And of course, I talked to a priest once and I was talking to him about celibacy. And he said, do you think people who are celibate, knowing that he was someone who knew a lot of people who were celibate, are their lives any the less rich for their celibacy? He says, no, funnily enough, it's quite the reverse. But that the energy that would have gone into the intimate relationships has to find an expression and finds wonderful expressions in all sorts of other ways. So not to be neurotic about it, but the advice that I was always given, which I pass on as well, is if you engage in society and do lots of interesting things, you'll meet people and you'll find people you get on with. And you don't need to jump into bed immediately with people to tick the box of you're having an intimate relationship. Maybe get to know people as friends and see what grows out of it. I had a long-term relationship for about 8 years with someone actually in AA. And that's how it happened. I wasn't looking for it. But I got to know them as a friend. And one day we were playing piano duets, and then the next moment we weren't. And this took, we were friends for a while before, Foray's Dolly suite led on to something just as innocent, but rather different. So not making a project out of it can sometimes be the best way of dealing with it. Good generalship suggests that the question be attacked on the flank rather than risk a face-to-face confrontation. So So we're running out of time a little bit. Does anyone have any more questions on these topics? So the topics for next week, and then I think I'm done on this, are exercise and physical health, families, that'll be quick, workplace, and the larger topic of drama. If you've got, maybe some of you have got sponsees, who have a lot of drama, who have a lot of dramatic incidents and massive realizations every day of the week. How to deal with dramatic sponsees. So I think that's for next week. So I'll hand it back to you, Omar.
Okay, thank you, Tim, so much for the presentation. I think we have reached the end of the meeting. If there are no more questions, maybe I'll hand it back to you to end it with the serenity prayer.
Great. So let's close with the serenity prayer, using the word God as you do it and understand it. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.
Thank you, Tim.